The Orphan Train Riders, Charles' Christmas Gift by Amanda Zieba. Chapter 1. Charles woke up in a cold, dark room. Through his sleepy eyes, he looked around at the bed and small table next to it. On the table, the stub of a candle flickered, but didn't give off enough light to view the room properly. The blanket that covered him was scratchy, but he pulled it closer, trying to get warm. It was then that he realized he was holding something else. Clutched in his cold fingers was a small cloth-wrapped package. In the dark room, he wasn't able to see its contents, so he rolled over, hazily wondering where his mother was, and fell back asleep. The next time he woke, sharp rays of winter sun were shining through his window. The city was ready for another noisy day. Huddled in his blankets, he tried to remember how he had gotten into this room. Suddenly, he remembered the package in his hands. Charles sat up and carefully unwrapped the fabric and twine to reveal a letter, a newspaper clipping, and a few coins. Confused, Charles climbed out of bed, put on his coat, and walked out the door. He saw a dimly lit hallway that looked no more familiar than the room where he had just slept. Charles wandered for a few minutes before finding the front office and matron in charge. She, at least, with her friendly smile and red apron, looked somewhat familiar. When she saw him, her smile faded, and she looked at him with sad eyes. He didn't know why, but he suddenly had a sick feeling in his stomach. Unable to make a single sound, he handed over the letter. The matron showed him to a small sitting room and lowered him onto a comfy couch. After a deep sigh, she began to read him the letter. My dearest Charles, no one in this world has brought me more joy than you. I am sorry I cannot give you the life I dreamed for you, but do not doubt that you are greatly loved. You know that I have been sick, and I think my end is near. I'm going to the hospital because I cannot bear to have you wake and see me lifeless. Please remember me as I looked the day you were born, the happiest woman on earth. Our picture is in my locket, which I now give to you. The matron of this lodging house has agreed to take you to the Children's Aid Society, where you'll be put on a train with other children to go west to find a new home. I will be watching you from heaven. For Christmas, I am sure that you will get the special gift of a new family. Be brave, my Charles. All my love, Mama. Is she? Charles asked reluctantly, afraid to say the word dead aloud. Yes, darling, she's gone to live with the angels now. This news brought on a fresh wave of tears, through which the matron silently rocked him. Afterward, the matron dried Charles's eyes on her apron and gently reached for the collar of his shirt, pulling out a chain that had been fastened around his neck. Charles recognized it immediately as the necklace his mother wore and quickly opened the beautiful locket that hung from it. Through bleary eyes, he gazed upon his mother's loving face and began to cry all over again. The matron was patient and kind and let him wear out his grief and spill his tears while she softly stroked his sandy brown hair. At one point, the matron's assistant brought in a small breakfast, and Charles was persuaded to sit up and eat. While he ate, she told him of the journey he was about to take. Charles looked up at the assistant's beautiful face and dark hair through watery eyes. She is also going on the train your mother wrote of. She is heading to Canada to go back and live with her own family. She has been working in New York for a few years to raise money for her family, but has decided to move back home. I spoke to her last night about you, and she has agreed to be your riding partner until she switches trains for Toronto. So see, there is nothing to fear. It was only barely an hour into the day, and Charles was exhausted. It was all he could do to nod and then silently eat the breakfast that was placed before him. Chapter 2. The rest of the morning was a blur of slow-motion movement. Charles hardly remembered making his way from the sitting room to the small cove of a room where he packed his few belongings. After that, he was herded from his room to Anne's, where he watched as she stowed the last of her belongings into a large trunk. He vaguely remembered Anne showing him the newspaper article in his bundle promoting the orphan trains. The article said that the Children's Aid Society would help homeless children find new families to care for them. Now, as he sat on a bench in the open foyer of the Children's Aid Society building, he struggled to recall the details of their walk from the lodging house to where he sat now. All he knew was that his mother was gone and she wasn't coming back. Nothing else seemed to matter. He did have brief moments of thankfulness for Anne's kind face and gentle hand to hold. She seemed to take care of all the details while he sat and waited, too stunned or tired to cry anymore. All the while he clutched the handle of his carpet bag that contained his only change of clothes, their family Bible, and the bundle of items from his mother. With his hat pulled low over his eyes, he could almost block out the world around him, so he only saw the toes of Anne's shoes as she returned to where he sat. "All right, we're all set," Anne said as she sat down next to Charles. "We will be staying here tonight and then leaving on the noon train tomorrow. Mr. Trot, that man over there," she said, pointing, "will be in charge of you until you meet your new family." Charles listened without responding. He just sat silently on the bench, swinging his legs. "Well, this news might cheer you up. We are traveling in a Pullman car," Anne said excitedly. "I've never been in one, but I've heard they are ever so fancy. They have beds right there in the car that pull down so we can sleep while we ride through the night. Isn't that amazing?" "Yeah, sure," Charles said sadly, and shrugged his shoulders. None of what Anne was telling him seemed important. "We will probably see mountains covered in snow as well. Christmas snow is the most magical thing to see." For many minutes Anne continued to chat away, and Charles continued to sit silently as other children arrived at the Children's Aid Society. Soon the foyer was full of dirty-looking children. Some were crying, but more were looking around the room with wide, weary eyes. Some of the children were from an orphanage, while others were straight off the streets. As the foyer continued to fill, Anne scooted Charles over to make room for a boy and his little sister. "Hello, what's your name?" Anne asked welcomingly. "Georgie," the boy answered defiantly. "And this here's my sister Lily." He sniffed once and wiped a dirt-covered hand across his eyes, and then turned away from them. When it seemed like not another child could squeeze into the crowded space, a man came out of an office and stood before them. The children all quieted down. "Hello, children, my name is Mr. Trot," the man began cheerfully. "I know that right now you may be feeling scared or sad, but tomorrow we will be leaving by train to find you all new families. It will be a wonderful experience for you all." Charles looked at the other children's faces. No one looked excited. Mr. Trot continued, "First, let's get you cleaned up, and then we'll give you each a good meal." Encouraged by the thought of a full meal, the children moved towards the showers and followed the instructions they were given. Chapter 3. "Anne, please don't leave me," Charles begged, nearly crushing her hand. "I'm not leaving you. Not yet. We'll ride together on this first train." "Please stay with me. The whole way? Please, Anne," Charles whined. Anne looked down in his precious face. Then she sighed and tore her eyes away to look at Mr. Trot as he tried to organize the 35 street urchins now in his care. "Wait here. I'll be right back," Anne told Charles as she disentangled herself from his grasp. Charles watched anxiously as she moved across the platform and talked with Mr. Trot. As the conversation continued, Mr. Trot seemed to visibly relax, nodding and smiling as Anne talked. When she came back to sit next to him, Anne was also smiling. "Well, that's all fixed," she said assuredly. "What's fixed?" asked Charles. "I'll be riding with you until you meet your new family," Anne soothed. "You will? How did you fix that?" Charles asked, amazed. "Well, it seems that Mr. Trot could use a little help with all of you hooligans," she explained and ruffled his hair. Charles giggled. "I offered to stay on board and help keep the group organized, clean, quiet, and fed. In return, he has agreed to pay for my passage to the end of our journey with you children, and then back to the station in Buffalo, where I can board a train to Toronto and go to my family for Christmas." "Won't your mother be sad you are arriving late?" Charles asked, but his eyes were smiling. "A bit, but I've been away 6 years. What's a few more weeks?" she explained. Together they sat silently on the bench, watching the many people walk by. After a while, Charles tapped Anne on the hand to get her attention. He held his mother's letter in his hand out to her. "Anne, will you please?" Charles asked, a pleading look in his eyes. "Of course," she agreed, and prepared to read the letter for what seemed like the 100th time that morning. Charles sat back and closed his eyes. The letter was all he had left of his mother, and he couldn't get enough of hearing it read out loud. Anne had read the letter to him when they woke up in the morning, and again right before breakfast, and after morning prayers. She had read the letter twice to him on the bus that had transported them from the Children's Aid Society headquarters to the train station, and again while they sat and watched Mr. Trot order their tickets. She read it to him another time as they ate an orange and peanuts bought from the train vendors before boarding the train, and now she read it again as they sat waiting for the train to leave. "You know," Anne said, somewhat out of desperation, "you have heard me read this letter for you so many times that you might be able to read it for yourself. See here, this word with the large C is your name, Charles." For the first time since Anne had met him, she saw Charles smile. It was enough encouragement for her to continue the lesson. Anne read the letter with a new sense of purpose, and it wasn't long before Charles had memorized the shape and sound of his own name, his mother's name, and a few other words. After a bit more, Anne folded the letter. "That's enough for now. We'll be leaving soon, and you'll not want to miss the sights. We'll practice again a while later." Charles nodded in agreement and patiently waited to board the train. Chapter 4. At first none of the children spoke as the train made its way out of the city and into the country. They pressed their faces against the windows and watched with wide eyes as the train passed sights they had never seen before. Most of them had lived their entire lives in New York, but knew nothing about it. None of them had ever been far from their own neighborhood streets. Now the children saw new and exciting things through the train windows as they sped out of the city. There were tall buildings, a glamorous movie theater, open-air markets, and everywhere they looked, hundreds and hundreds of people. After a while, the buildings became shorter and fewer. The city roads and traffic disappeared. Soon the children were staring out at a wide open space. As Charles looked out at farm fields, he felt as if he could see to the edge of the earth. It was during this part of their journey that the children became curious about each other. They began to turn in their seats and talk to one another. Charles learned the names of the children around him, but not much more. No one was interested in sharing the past they were leaving behind. Instead, they began to talk about their new future. Anne told them the train would make many stops, but that they would only be getting off the train in Iowa, Nebraska, and Colorado. The children asked dozens of questions about these places, and Anne did her best to inform them with the little knowledge she had from her limited education. Anne explained that Iowa was mostly farm country, so as they traveled through it, they might see barns and silos and cows. She had to explain to many of the children that cows were black and white animals that made milk. All of the children's faces lit up with wonder, except Charles. He wasn't too sure he believed everything she told them. Anne said that Nebraska was also farming country, but it was known for being very flat. Anne told them that Nebraska might be a boring state to travel through, but a very nice place to live. Finally, she told them about the beautiful mountains of Colorado. Charles closed his eyes and tried to imagine life in any of these places. What he really wanted was to be back home with his mother. The next few hours, the children discussed where they would most like to live and what their new lives would be like. Some hoped for a life on the farm away from the noisy city. They liked the idea of living in a place with animals and thought there might be lots of food on a farm. Anne assured them that most farmers had chickens, cows, and gardens, so more than likely food would be plentiful. Other children hoped to live in a city because that is what they were used to. They were worried they might not know how to live on a farm and grow food. Some of the children hoped for new siblings. Some hoped for a ma that didn't drink and a pa that didn't hit. Charles didn't know what he hoped for. He wasn't sure he wanted a new ma, or any brothers or sisters at all. He still missed his own ma terribly. Charles absent-mindedly fingered the bundle his mother had left him, thinking about her best parts, her comforting hugs, her smile, and her ability to make a delicious soup out of almost anything. As his thoughts wandered and his fingers moved over the fabric, he suddenly gasped. Anne looked over at him, clearly concerned. "What is it?" she asked. "This," he exclaimed, pointing to his bundle. "This cloth is from my mama's best dress." As realization hit him, he hugged the bundle tightly to his chest. He was thrilled to have another physical memory of his mother. Anne smiled down at him as she wrapped her arms around his small shoulders and gave him a quick squeeze. The train continued to move further and farther from New York City. The land that he could see was covered with a light sprinkling of snow. In the city, snow made things wet and dirty, but out here it made things beautiful. The sight of the sparkling landscape gave him hope. Charles told himself that each mile was a mile closer to his new family, a family his mother wanted him to find. At the lodging house and even at the train station, he hadn't had much time to think about what his life might be like from now on. But now, as it got closer every minute, he began to wonder and worry. Chapter 5. After a few hours, the scenery lost its thrill. The daylight faded and the long evening hours dragged on. As it grew darker, the children could no longer see anything out the windows. Finally, it was time for the children to go to sleep. The Pullman beds were lowered. The emotionally worn children needed no coaxing to climb into the beds, close their eyes, and be lulled to sleep by the steady movement of the train. Charles lay down in his bed and squeezed his eyes shut, wanting everything just to melt away and go back to the way it had been before his mother died. Before he knew it, he fell asleep. As the children slept, the train brought them closer and closer to their first stop, Springville, Iowa. They had been riding for a few hours past sunrise when all of a sudden the frozen and barren cornfields gave way to a little town. The children crowded the windows to get a peek at what could be their new home. The train came to a stop at a snow-covered train station, and the children immediately jumped up from their seats, both restless from their long ride and anxious about the upcoming events. Together, Mr. Trot and Anne struggled to control them, helping them change into their clean uniforms and comb their hair. Finally, the children were dressed and looking suitable. "Now, children," Mr. Trot addressed them, "we will walk quietly to a church just a few blocks away. When we get there, you will stand up in front for all the people to see. We've sent word we'd be arriving today, so there should be many families looking for children. However, I should tell you that families rarely adopt more than one child. No siblings will... However, I should tell you that families rarely adopt more than one child, so siblings will probably be separated." "What'd you say?" came an angry voice from the back of the car. Mr. Trot surveyed the children until he found the source of the noise. He saw Georgie standing up, his little sister clinging to his leg. "I'm sorry, Georgie, but that's the truth. 2 homes are better than no home at all. Lily would be healthier without you than she'd be starving on the streets," Mr. Trot explained. "Well, if we can't go together, we ain't going at all," he shouted, and Lily began to cry. "Suit yourself," Mr. Trot sighed. "If that's the way you feel, you must leave the train." "Fine," Georgie shouted. "Come on, Lily." Anne tried to change her mind, but Georgie would not listen. He stormed off the train, pulling a crying Lily behind him. Mr. Trot motioned for the other children to follow him, and then he turned to exit the train. The children trailed after him and stepped out onto the platform. A chilled December wind blew their hair back off their faces as they walked down the street. The children were used to the harsh, cold streets of New York, but with the open plains the wind whipped around them and chilled them to their bones. Charles held Anne's hand tightly and tried not to cry. He was excited that he might find the new home that his mother wanted for him, but he also felt that everything was happening too fast. When they arrived at the church, Charles didn't know whether to feel glad to be out of the cold or scared of the crowd of people he saw gathered there. Most of the people were bundled up in coats, so Charles could not tell much about them. His heart began to race. Leading the ragtag group, Mr. Trot marched them to the front of the church and organized them into line by age. Then he turned to talk to the people gathered there. "Thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Before you stand 33 children in need of good Christian homes. You have all read our requirements, and if you feel you can provide for a child in your home, we will be happy to help you through the process. Now, you may line up and talk to the children. If you find a good match, please walk with the child to the back of the church and we will complete the necessary paperwork." Even before Mr. Trot finished talking, people were bustling to stand in line, eager to be the first to make their choices. Charles looked around nervously for Anne, but saw that she was busy with some of the younger children. Even though he didn't want to look like a baby, he began to cry. Some couples tried to stop and talk to him, cheer him up even, but he was too upset to get out any understandable words. He kept his head down, and eventually people gave up and moved on to the older children, who seemed more eager to get selected. By the end of the afternoon, 20 children had been chosen, leaving Mr. Trot with a mountain of paperwork, and Anne with 13 children to console. She did her best to convince them that the perfect families were waiting for them in Nebraska or maybe Colorado, but the children sat quietly with sad faces. The children ate the dinner that had been graciously provided by the ladies of the church, and then began the trek back to the station. Each child felt miserable. It had been snowing, so there were several inches of snow on the ground, and by the time they arrived at the train, their little feet were soaking and their cheeks were streaked with frozen tears. When they reached the train, Charles saw Georgie and Lily. He had worried about them and was glad to see they had returned. They were huddled together waiting beside the train. They looked cold, hungry, scared, and if possible, even more miserable than the children marching back from the church. When Georgie saw the group, he rushed up to Mr. Trot and begged him for forgiveness and a second chance. Mr. Trot grumbled, but finally agreed to allow them to continue on the journey. When all the children were settled onto the train, Anne opened a small hamper and gave Georgie and Lily an apple to share and one bologna sandwich that was left over from the previous day. The brother and sister gobbled it up quickly and then cuddled together in a seat and fell asleep. Charles sat quietly as the train pulled out of the station. There had not been a woman in the whole group that Charles would have wanted for a new ma, but there may have been a family for Georgie and Lily if they had gone along. Mr. Trot should have explained that there was also a chance that a family might adopt them both, even if it was a small chance. A short while after the train departed, Charles leaned over to ask Anne to read his letter yet again, but he found that she was sleeping. He decided to pull out the letter anyway and was surprised that he recognized so many of the words: Charles, Mama, love, home. Using what he knew, he tried to puzzle through some of the unknown words in the letter, and when he had gone through that, he took out the newspaper article and began working through that as well. When Anne awoke, she found him bent over the papers, his finger trailing over the lines of print. When he saw her watching him, he excitedly pointed out all the new words he knew. Anne squeezed his shoulders and smiled. This time they read the letter together, Anne's voice filling in when Charles went silent. It was a wonderful way to pass the time, and before they knew it, the sky was getting dark, and Mr. Trot was directing them to pull down their beds. After he led them in their nightly prayers, Anne tucked the children in bed and wished them sweet dreams. She explained that when they awoke, the train would have brought them many hours closer to their next stop, in Lincoln, Nebraska. Chapter 6. The arrival in Nebraska was much the same as Iowa. The children washed their faces, put on nice clothes, and walked to the local meeting place, this time a movie theater. Lincoln was larger than Springville, but not as big as New York City. There was plenty to look at and listen to as they traveled down the streets in a neat line. As they walked, Charles heard Georgie talking to Lily. "Don't worry. I won't let them split us up, even if I did promise Mr. Trot. If everyone acts like they want only one of us, we will behave badly to change their mind. Then we can try our luck in Colorado. If it doesn't work, Mr. Trot said we can always go back to New York." "But I don't want to go back to New York," Lily complained. "Neither do I," agreed Georgie, "so put on a smile and act real nice, but don't let go of my hand. We need to show everyone that we are together." Charles hoped the best for them. He wondered if Georgie would really be able to stop Mr. Trot from allowing someone to adopt only one of them. Charles looked up at Anne. She noticed the worry on his face and began to give him a short pep talk. "Charles, do you remember what your mother asked of you in her letter? She asked you to be brave. Do you think you can put on a brave face here and maybe even talk to a few nice men and women?" "Okay, I'll try," Charles answered. Facing the somewhat smaller crowd, Charles tried his best to be brave. He managed not to cry, but could only meet questions with short answers. It seemed like city folk in Lincoln were looking for a chatty, outgoing child, and quiet Charles just faded into the background of the movie theater stage he stood on. One child that was standing out, although not in a good way, was Georgie. He was yelling at a woman. "You take your hands off her. I said no unless you take us both. I don't care what that old man told you. You can't have her." Mr. Trot came over and tried to pull Lily away from Georgie, but the boy kicked and Lily screamed. The couple turned away appalled. In the end, Georgie and Lily did not get separated, but they did not get chosen either. 9 more children were adopted in Nebraska, leaving 4 feeling unwanted and miserable. Charles, Georgie, Lily, and a 14-year-old girl named Marguerite remained in the care of Mr. Trot. He spoke to Charles and the girls kindly. He told them not to give up hope. He did not smile at Georgie. After Mr. Trot finished his paperwork and all of the families had left with their new additions, he walked the small crew back to the station. This time there had been no special meal offered, so the children had to face the dreaded bologna sandwiches again. The children settled into their seats quickly and ate their dinners on their laps as the train chugged out of the station toward Colorado. Charles' stomach hurt thinking about the next stop. If he did not get chosen in Colorado, he would have to go back to New York and either live in an orphanage on the streets. Mr. Trot told him he could ride another orphan train if he didn't find a family on this trip, but going through all this again seemed like an even worse option. The other children must have had similar thoughts because they were all quiet until they heard Georgie talking to Lily about St. Nicholas and Christmas. Charles' ears perked up and he tried to listen in. When he heard Georgie telling the Christmas story wrong, he yelled at him. "That's not part of the Christmas story." "Yes, it is. Don't you know anything?" snapped Georgie. "Well, I know about Jesus and the wise men and the star," Charles insisted defensively. "Then you know about the important parts," Anne declared. "Yeah, but not the fun parts," Georgie shot back. "Fine, then tell me," Charles shouted, which earned him a nasty look from Mr. Trot. All right, that's enough," quieted Anne. "I have an idea. Why don't we all go around and tell about one tradition that we have participated in to celebrate Christmas?" It was obvious in the speed at which the children quieted down that they liked her idea. "I'll go first," Anne volunteered. "In Canada, which is where I'm from, my family eats a roast goose dinner with plum pudding for dessert." "Sounds delicious," Marguerite said. "It is," Anne said, smiling at the sweet girl. "Now, Georgie, why don't you share?" The generally surly boy now looked shy with all eyes on him. Given a nudge of encouragement from his little sister who sat next to him, he began to share. "In the city I sold newspapers. Once I borrowed, a Sears Roebuck catalog from a Sunday issue. My sister and I liked to pretend we were rich and picked out presents that we would like to buy for each other. I was going to buy her a teddy bear." He looked with affection in her direction. Anne nodded in understanding and turned her eyes to Lily. "Georgie helped me write a letter to St. Nicholas," Lily shared. "I asked him to bring me a tea set this year." "Who's St. Nicholas?" Charles asked. "Sheesh, don't you know anything?" Georgie groaned with an eye roll. "Georgie," Anne said with a warning in her voice, "instead of being rude, why don't you explain to Charles who St. Nicholas is?" "All right," Georgie began. "St. Nicholas is a chubby old guy who wears a red suit. He flies all over the world delivering gifts to kids on Christmas Eve." "Really?" asked Charles in amazement. "How does he fly?" "In a big sleigh that's pulled by flying reindeer," Lily exclaimed. Charles just stared at Georgie and Lily in wonder. He wasn't too sure he believed what they were telling him, but Anne had been right about the train and the farms and so many other things he didn't know about before leaving the city. Maybe this was true too. "Is that really true?" Charles asked. "I don't know for sure," Georgie confessed and dropped his voice. "He never came to our place." "At Christmas time in the orphanage, we hung stockings by the fireplace. The matron there told us that if we'd been good all year, St. Nicholas would leave coins and fruit in them, even for poor kids like us," Marguerite shyly explained. "And did he?" Charles asked. "He did," Marguerite said. "Maybe at your new home you can teach them that tradition and all hang up stockings," Anne suggested. Marguerite brightened at the idea. Finally, it was Charles's turn to share. "On the night before Christmas, my mother always read the Nativity story from the Bible." "What a wonderful tradition," Charles commented. Charles nodded and then remembered the book in his bag. He scrambled to open it and pulled out the tattered Bible. "Anne, will you please?" Charles asked. "I'd love to," Anne said, accepting the book in her lap. She opened the book to a red ribbon marking just the right page and began to read. All of the children listened to Anne as she told the Christmas story. For a while, they all forgot about their troubles and worries. Charles was especially enjoying the reading. When Anne finished the Christmas story, the children got ready for bed. As Charles lay in his Pullman bed, he thought about the traditions of the other children. He loved hearing the Christmas story, but thought that St. Nicholas and stockings might be fun too. Just before he fell asleep, he remembered his mother's letter. He decided that the gift of a new family would be nice for Christmas as well. Chapter 7. As the train pulled into the station in Colorado Springs, the children could see evergreen trees growing along the tracks. When they pressed their faces up to the windows, they could see the main street of the town. It looked as if Christmas had come early. Colored lights were strung from the station roof, and a beautifully decorated tree could be seen in the town square. The usual proceedings of washing and dressing were done with extra care. Anne neatly combed each of the boys' hair and beautifully braided the girls'. She reminded them to smile and answer questions politely. It did not take long before the small group was making its way toward the church. Just before Anne took them into the church, she led them in a brief prayer. Finally, feeling as if she had done her best for them, she ushered them to the front and then found a seat for herself in the back. Charles had tucked his mother's letter into his pocket to remind himself to be brave. He squeezed it once for luck and then forced himself to look out at the crowd. It was the smallest group of people they had seen yet, but he tried to keep a positive attitude and hope for the best, as Mr. Trot had suggested. As the couples began to file past the children, Charles' stomach filled with the now familiar butterflies. Charles closed his eyes and tried to imagine his mother's face. For a moment, he could really see her in his mind. She was smiling at him and telling him that she had already picked out a special family for him. When Charles opened his eyes, he watched several couples glance his way and then pass him by. But then one couple stopped in front of him. The man was tall and thick and had a big bushy beard. The woman was wearing a beautiful red cloak with a fur around the hood. They both knelt down so that they were able to look him directly in the face. Charles smiled at the woman because somehow she reminded him of the lodging-house matron and St. Nicholas at the same time, which seemed a funny thing to him. The woman returned his smile. The woman tapped her husband's shoulder and nodded at Charles. "Hello, young man. What is your name?" the man asked. "Charles, sir. I'm 6. It's nice to meet you. My name is John, and this is my wife, Ellen." "How do you do, ma'am?" Charles responded politely, the way that Anne had instructed all the children to do. "Well, we could be better," John started with a sigh. Charles looked up at the sound of the man's voice, but the man began to explain a bit about their home and lifestyle. "We live on a large stretch of land in the foothills of the mountains. We raise sheep, lots of sheep, and we need a little help. But more than that, we need someone to share it with. We haven't been able to have children of our own, so when we saw the flyer last week at church about the orphan train coming to town, we knew we had to come. We are really hoping we can find a child who would like to live with us." Charles wasn't sure what to say. He swayed back and forth from one foot to another, wondering if he would like sheep. "We prayed every day that there would be a special child just for us," the woman explained. "A gift from God." Charles smiled. He too had prayed that there would be a special gift of a family just for him. He wondered if there were any chance that the couple felt that way about him. The man bent closer. "I think you might just be that special gift. Would you be interested in coming home with us?" Charles was nervous. He shrugged. "We have sheep and horses and dogs. We can teach you how to ride and care for the animals. You can help John with the herding and me with the wool shearing and spinning. We always have lots of warm blankets and clothes from the wool we produce." Charles began to feel overwhelmed by the thought. "It's a lot of work, our life, but it's a good one, and we'd like to share it with you," John continued. "We live quite a ways out of town, so we only come in on Sundays for church and shopping. I'd teach you your schooling most days at home myself. Do you know how to read?" Ellen asked. "Well," Charles began to answer, looking to find Anne in the crowd. When she nodded approvingly, he answered, "A little," as he pulled the letter out of his pocket. "I can read most of this letter that my ma wrote to me before she left. Would you like to hear me read it?" The woman nodded. Charles pulled out the letter and began to read. He had most of it memorized, so he did not stumble over the words. As he read aloud, the crowd and their noise dwindled to silence. Everyone listened as he read. When he neared the end of the letter, his eyes began to fill with tears. When he finished, he carefully folded the letter and looked at the couple standing before him. Their hands were clutching each other, and their eyes were also full of tears. Ellen motioned him forward as if to tell him a secret. Charles bent from the stage to put his little tear-streaked face close to the woman's beautiful cloaked face. "If you would come live with us, we could be each other's Christmas gift," she whispered, and then flashed him a radiant smile. "Will you come with us?" Charles closed his eyes again. This time he saw his mother smiling and nodding her head. Charles opened his eyes, looked from her to John, and then threw himself into their arms. Chapter 8. Charles awoke in the darkness, and it took him a second to remember where he was. Winter moonlight poured through his window, and he smelled the now familiar scent of wood smoke from the fireplace downstairs. Charles smiled as he pulled up the thick blankets of wool and settled back into sleep. When he awoke again, the room was beginning to lighten, and he could see a soft snow falling out his window. The delicious smells of breakfast were wafting up to his loft bedroom, and he could hear the voices of Mama Ellen and Papa John downstairs. Instead of bounding out of bed as he planned to do this Christmas morning, he stayed snuggled in. He thought about the evening before, Christmas Eve. Neighbors from a nearby farm visited them. They had 2 boys, children near his own age, and they had a time of their lives playing in the mountainous snow that had fallen over the last week. With the help of their fathers, they had built giant men out of snow and raced down hills on boards with metal runners. Last night they had a feast of mutton and wild onion roast from their farm, surrounded by beans and potatoes from their neighbors. For dessert they had tasty wild raspberry pie. Just before the family left, Papa John had read the nativity story, just like Charles's mama had done for him every Christmas he could remember in the past. When he could stand it no longer, Charles rolled out of bed and climbed down from the loft to join his new family. After big breakfast, they all settled around the fragrant pine tree to open gifts. Charles watched excitedly as Mama Ellen opened a beautiful new hair comb that Papa John had helped Charles pick out from a new store in town. Next, Papa John opened a new wool work hat Mama Ellen had made him. "I picked red, so Mama Ellen could see you far out in the grazing field and always know where we are," Charles explained. "It fits just right, and red happens to be my favorite color," Papa John praised enthusiastically. Charles felt a little overwhelmed when 2 packages and a lovely red envelope were set before him. He'd never received so many Christmas gifts before. "The letter is from Anne," Mama Ellen explained. "Open your gifts first," Papa John instructed. Charles nodded, set the letter aside, and then opened the smallest package first. Inside he found his very first book. He marveled at the cloth binding and carefully turned the pages with wonder. Since he had joined the family, he sat with Mama Ellen an hour each day working on reading and number facts. He was getting quite good. It would be a thrill to have some more reading material. Charles set the book aside and turned his attention to the larger package. He undid the ribbon to find that the wrapping itself was the present. He unfolded the large cloth and spread it out to see it clearly. He stood tall to see it for its whole and then bent down to see it for its tiny pieces. The gift was a lovely handmade quilt. Charles gasped in amazement when he saw at the very bottom corner a heart made from the fabric of his mother's dress, the fabric that had held her letter, newspaper article, and coins. With blue thread, his mother's initials had been carefully stitched into it. The quilt represented both his old life and his new life. Charles hugged Mama Ellen and Papa John. "Thank you for these, but the greatest gift of all is having a new family." Mama Ellen smothered him in kisses, and Papa John pulled him into a large bear hug. Afterward, December 12th, 1904. Dear Charles, I've made it safely home and I am enjoying a wonderful holiday season with my family. Canada is very different from New York, but I am happy with my decision to return home. I am enjoying getting familiar with my family and childhood home again. My biggest news is that I've decided to enter school to become a teacher. I have you to thank for that. If I had not met you, I would never have known how much I enjoyed teaching someone to read, or how wonderful it is to look after children, even noisy ones like Georgie. Speaking of, have you seen Georgie, Lily, and Marguerite lately? I haven't heard from them since I left Colorado. It was hard leaving you all there, but easier, I suppose, knowing you are now with good families. Please send me news of them and yourself. I hope that you have a wonderful Christmas and that I hear from you soon. Love from Canada, Anne. January 1st, 1905. Dear Anne, Happy New Year! Mama Ellen and I have been working on this letter for a few days, and I hope you are happy and healthy when you read it. We went to town a few days ago, and I saw Georgie and Lily. They looked very nice in new clothes and very happy with their new ma and pa. They look healthy. Mama Ellen says it must be all the mountain air doing them good. Marguerite was also at church and says to tell you hello. She is happy in her new home and is learning to knit and sew our wool into mittens and sweaters, just like her new mama. We have had a perfect Christmas here in Colorado. We spent a lot of time with our neighbors, and I had a great time playing in the snow with them. We also went into town for church on Christmas Day. I got a new book for Christmas, and each day I look forward to my lessons when I can read. Mama Ellen and I think you will be a marvelous teacher and wish you good luck at school. Thank you for riding with me on the Orphan Train and helping me locate the special Christmas gift that my mother wanted me to find. A loving family. Love, Charles.